Absolutely. This is what I was going to start with, so already my introduction is over. No, but I'm really glad that we can welcome today among us Chris Lockhart from New Zealand, who almost became our colleague, as Lucia already said, and he's a real person. We met him in Athens at the ISPP conference. It was really great to meet him in person. And he would have fitted our team very well because his work is on sort of on religion, on identities, on values, and on different social political outcomes. So basically, he's a political psychologist in a way, interested in religion and religious identities, religious values, etc. Sorry, Chris, for simplifying your work. And basically, he did all his undergraduate studies and his PhD at the University of Auckland when he was part of the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study, which is a very, very exciting study, longitudinal study of, as the name of the panel implies, of attitudes and values of New Zealand people. But it's quite amazing what these researchers managed to build. And today, as I just learned, he's a postdoc at the University of Canterbury, where he works or he focuses on the impact of climate change on Indigenous people in terms of their original cultural values. And I won't talk too much anymore. I'm really glad, Chris, that you accepted our invitation. We hope to see you again in person soon. But for the moment, we need to do with you being online, and we are really excited to find out more about your research and your PhD, basically, because we have had some tasting at the ISPP in Athens, but this will be more elaborate, and I'm really looking forward to it. So the floor is yours, and I'm shutting myself.
Great. Hi, everybody. Yes, as Barbara said, I'm Christopher Lockhart from I did my PhD at the University of Auckland, but I'm currently with the University of Canterbury down in Christchurch. Thank you very much to Barbara and Lucia and the entire Institute for inviting me to do this talk. It's a great opportunity, and thank you to everyone who turned up for your attention. So as Barbara alluded to, I'm a political psychologist by background with an interest in religious beliefs and their effects on socio-political outcomes. And what I'll be talking to you about today is the work that I did for my PhD, which was looking at the countervailing impacts of religion and spirituality on a variety of social and political attitudes and outcomes, because I'm particularly interested in the multidimensionality of religion. And I think it's a very pertinent field of research for today. So yeah. So as I've tentatively titled, my work is looking at this religious paradox. So just to give a little bit of a background in terms of religion and how it impacts political ideology and identities, there has been this prevailing idea across modern democracies and societies that there is a separation, or needs to be a separation, between religious and secular institutions, between church and state. And this is actually quite an old idea. It comes from older ideas about the role of religion and secular or temporal authorities and the distinct roles that they've played traditionally throughout history in terms of how societies are structured and such. And whilst that always hasn't eventuated, there has been that sort of distinction in terms of the roles that they've played. And in the modern societies, we see once again that there is a complex interplay between religion and politics, particularly and almost uniquely manifested in the way that democracies themselves are now organized, where political attitudes and policies and such are determined by public vote, typically, hopefully. And so in that sense, because real people are, by nature religious, religion is a cultural norm across many countries, religion does have a very strong influence on political attitudes and political discourse, as well as, how politics is enacted and expressed. So across many democracies, politics and religion have been shown to be strongly intertwined. For example, religion is one of the strongest predictors of political identification, political affiliation, and as well as voting behavior. And religion, in particular, religion has shown strong convergence with conservative ideology on a number of moral and political issues, such as attitudes towards abortion, attitudes towards same-sex marriage, and things like environmental conservation. So there is across the literature this broad connection between religious affiliation and identities and conservative ideals. Now, one of the possible reasons for this is that religion and conservatism share some sort of socio-cognitive motives, or they're rooted in the same sort of ideological or value-based systems. So what Jost and colleagues argue is that religion and conservatism both stem from socio-cognitive motives for security, stability, and tradition in an uncertain world. Indeed, religious belief is correlated with a greater need for closure, an intolerance of ambiguity, and a corresponding increase in dogmatic thought and judgment certainty. And so what religion seems to promise, according to the literature, is a stable and binding social group to ameliorate concerns about ambiguity and uncertainty. And religion might be, or is argued to be, particularly good at this because it has a sense of traditionalism that is extremely old. Most religious traditions, or at least the major religious traditions, tend to be thousands of years old, which creates this idea of continuity and perpetuity. And religion is also, or at least typically, religion seems to promote or offer this idea of an afterlife, an eternal one. And so in that sense, religion seems to promise an eternal group membership. You will be part of this religious group for eternity, into some sort of hypothetical afterlife. So what this seems to suggest is that religion and conservatism have this shared endorsement of the values of conformity and tradition. And this has been shown in some of the work like Saraglu and Schwartz, who showed that religion and conservatism tends to be rooted in the same sort of conservation values, which seek to structure and organize people's lives in ways that will help them deal with, uncertainty and ambiguity and such. And these values tend to be things like conformity to norms, endorsement of traditional norms, etc. Now, religion is also positively correlated with a deference to authority. And so I just want to talk a little bit about this idea of deference to authority because it exists within this broader framework as suggested by Schwartz and others, which concerns itself with the structure of social groups. So deference to authority sort of talks about, as a value, it talks about the structure of hierarchies. It combines with other conservation values to create this broader sense of valuing stable and structured groups. And religion is positively correlated with deference to authority and in turn conservatism. So deference to authority as a value is argued to sort of mediate this relationship between religion and conservatism. And certainly both religion and conservatism seem to be strongly motivated by this respect for authority value. An important part of this as well is that both religion and conservatism are strongly related to this idea of preferring the in-group over out-groups. And essentially why this seems to be is that if religion and conservatism want to create a stable group for people to feel comfortable in, the best way to do that is to focus on the sort of reciprocity and interrelational independence that in-groups seem to foster. So it essentially creates a supportive network that also functions by creating this sort of in-group, out-group discrimination, not discrimination, but in-group, out-group distinction. So religion and conservatism are both associated with this idea of selective prosociality. Past work has demonstrated that religious charity tends to be oriented towards charities that share one's religious beliefs or faiths. So there is also work that shows that religious individuals show more pro-social behaviors towards those who share their religious identities compared to those who do not. I mean, even more broadly, there is work that that shows that religious identifiers are more likely to help people who identify as religious, even if they don't share the same faith, compared to those who don't identify as religious or atheists or whatever it is that they identify with. So there is this idea, and it comes from evolutionary psychology, that religion acts to bind groups together through sort of selection and signaling. Now, one expression of this sort of selective prosociality might be right-wing authoritarianism, which is an attitude that is rooted in a threat-based worldview and a conformist personality. Now, what I propose, or what has been proposed as well, is that right-wing authoritarianism reflects the values that lie at the heart of religion and conservative ideologies. So I've talked about how religion and conservatism show strong overlap with the values of conformity and tradition and respect for authority. And you can see that there is strong conceptual overlap with the subdomains that right-wing authoritarianism encapsulates, which is obedience to authority or authoritarian submission, conformity to norms, conventionalism, and a coercive social control of deviance. Right-wing authoritarianism also shares this promotion, or these roots in a conformist personality, so low openness and high conscientiousness, which is often a hallmark of religious identifiers. And indeed, across the literature, right-wing authoritarianism is a well-known predictor of religious beliefs and vice versa. And right-wing authoritarianism is similarly a well-known predictor of conservative socio-political beliefs. So past work has demonstrated that, and in terms of the religion to authoritarianism relationship, past work has shown that church attendance, as an example, is strongly related with authoritarianism. Similarly, Schaefer and Hastings in 2007 demonstrated that authoritarians are more religious than those low on RWA, which suggests that authoritarian individuals are more likely to become part of or hold on to religious identities. Now, an important part of RWA is that it is a core component of the dual process model of conservative ideology. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this dual process model, but just to outline the framework that it proposes, it essentially proposes that conservatism and the expression of that ideology in terms of things like right-wing politics, nationalism, ethnocentrism, and intergroup conflict, or intolerance and prejudice, is motivated by two political attitudes, essentially, or two ideological attitudes. The first one here, which I've been talking about, is right-wing authoritarianism. And like I mentioned, it's rooted in this dangerous and threatening worldview, as well as a social conformity, a personality that values social conformity. And it is essentially engenders a dangerous perception of the world. The world is a dangerous place, and motivates this idea that that outgroups are threatening and thus need to be controlled. Now, this all maps on quite closely conceptually and empirically with religion. Religion tends to be rooted in this sort of dangerous worldview as well, and it tends to predict conservative ideology. And so what we see here is that religion shares strong conceptual overlap with authoritarianism. Authoritarianism then might be a possible explanation for the relationship between religion and conservative ideology. If what lies at the heart of both religion and conservative beliefs is this endorsement of specific values, then RWA might be an expression of these values. Or it might just be an attitude that seems to coincide with these two. So now, what has been missing from the literature is a proper examination of the temporal ordering of the relationship between religion and RWA. So if RWA is an expression of these sort of two, of the sort of values that lie at the heart of religion, then you would expect that authoritarians would be more likely to be religious. It would be that there is some sort of selection effect, rather than religious people becoming authoritarian. You would expect that authoritarians would become religious, because religion appeals to their authoritarian sensibilities. On the other hand, other work has suggested that religion could foster authoritarianism, which would suggest more of an enculturation effect. So essentially what we're looking at with this idea of a temporal ordering is what exists prior almost. Is authoritarianism an expression of values that would lead to religious belief? Or is it that religion has within it authoritarian ideals and instills those ideals into those who follow it? And so again, we have this idea of an enculturation versus a selection effect. And so in terms of the work that I'll be presenting today, this theme rather, encapsulates the first theme of the work that I'll be presenting, which is this idea of a temporal ordering. And I hope that some of the work that I show you today sort of gives you a better idea of what sort of research that I'm particularly interested in when I'm pursuing this line of investigation. Now, we talked a lot about how religion and authoritarianism are related, and how religion and conservatism are related. And what this seems to indicate is that religion is associated with a very selective form of prosociality and with a preference for the in-group over out-groups. But this seems paradoxical, and this goes back to the theme of this, the title of this presentation, which is the idea of this religious paradox. Because religion isn't just this sort of traditionalist, structured kind of ideology that fosters authoritarian ideals. There has been work that has shown that religion is not just selectively pro-social, but is also associated with universal prosociality. So for example, Preston and Ritter in 2013 showed that religious prosociality can be both selective and universal. They gave participants religious versus God primes. So they primed either religious concepts using things like the Bible or church or religious authorities of some sort. And then they also primed participants with God primes. So reminding participants about greater conceptual religious ideas like God or other spiritual ideas. And what they showed was that when participants were primed with religious primes, they showed higher levels of in-group prosociality. But when they were primed with God primes, they showed greater out-group prosociality. And so what we can see just from this simple priming work is that there's some delineation when it comes to what religion means in terms of its outcomes on prosocial behavior. So the association between religion and RWA often obfuscates that religion is an umbrella term and it encompasses a multidimensional, encompasses multidimensionality, a number of variables that are of interest and competing with one another in terms of the outcomes that they produce when it comes to politics and other social outcomes. So what we see is that across the literature, religious multidimensionality has shown a number of differing socio-political outcomes. For example, the work of Hirsch and colleagues in 2013 looked at spirituality as a distinct form of religious belief or religious identification from religiosity. And they noted that spirituality, rather than this idea of religion, which is rooted in these values that I've been talking about of conformity, tradition, and respect for authority, spirituality seems to encompass an aspect of religion that is more associated with the values of things like benevolence and universalism. And what benevolence and universalism are rooted in is this idea of a sort of transcendental or self-transcendence value orientation, a connection between oneself and others in terms of in-group prosociality with regards to benevolence, but universalism also by contrast refers to a more universal, holistic connection with other outgroups as well as with nature. And so what Hirsch and colleagues discovered was that spirituality is associated with more egalitarian outcomes. And they expressed these egalitarian outcomes through lower endorsement of social dominance orientation. So what this indicates is that dimensions of religion which endorse benevolence and universalism might negatively predict anti-egalitarian attitudes, in this case, social dominance orientation. And so I just want to mention what social dominance orientation is for those of you who are unfamiliar. SDO reflects an anti-egalitarian attitude driven by a competitive worldview and a disagreeable personality. So that is low agreeableness. And what's important here is that SDO reflects the other pathway in the dual process model, which predicts conservative socio-cognitive outcomes. So I'll just bring that up briefly in a second, but I want to mention that SDO conceptually and empirically is distinct, or rather is negatively associated with some of the things that we associate with religion across the field. So religion is associated with lower endorsement of competitive values such as power and self-enhancement. Religion is also associated with higher endorsement of agreeableness. So what that would indicate is that religion shouldn't be predicting or should be negatively predicting this sort of anti-egalitarian attitude, because it is essentially characterized by people who are disagreeable and focused on power and self-enhancement, both of the things which religion attempts to discourage, or at least is negatively associated with. So because SDO reflects the other pathway in the dual process model, as you can see here, SDO is related to this idea of a competitive worldview, tough-mindedness, group dominance, and competition. We would expect that religion would negatively be associated with SDO and thus conservative ideology. And so this comes to this idea of the countervailing association, which is why I've titled this presentation, the countervailing association, which is that religion may have essentially two different aspects religion has two different aspects which have countervailing effects on conservative ideology. So while religion may positively predict conservative identification through higher right-wing authoritarianism, religion may also negatively predict conservatism through lower social dominance orientation. And what the distinction here is that there is, or rather the only way to tap into these is by acknowledging that religion is a multidimensional variable, and that there needs to be examination of these different aspects and approaches to religion in order to tap into these countervailing associations. And so collectively, this process reflects two independent pathways through which religion, as well as its sub-variables, I suppose you could call it, influences socio-political outcomes. And as I said, countervailing effects are rooted in religion's multidimensionality. So this forms the second theme of this presentation, which is that if you examine religion more closely and delineate between some of the aspects of religion in terms of what values it prioritizes, what moral foundations it prioritizes, or just what its cognitive or motivational approach is, then you can see distinct effects in terms of socio-political outcomes. So just an overview. When we're talking about religion, we could be talking about a lot of different things. Like I said, religion is very multidimensional. We could be talking about, so these are the definitions that I prefer in terms of what we're talking about when it comes to religious variables. We could be looking at religious affiliation, which is simply identifying as religious. We could be looking at spirituality, including beliefs in a higher power and a connection with humankind. We could be looking at specific faiths, which would be affiliations with a religious group or sect. We could be looking at religiosity or religious identification, to what degree a person identifies with their religion and considers it an important aspect in their life. We could be looking at religious orientations, which include motivational and cognitive approaches to one's religion. And we could be looking at any other kind of religious variable like behavioral measures, etc., frequency of prayer or whatnot. Now, in the studies, because I only have 4 studies that I'm presenting you, I'm not using all of these variables like that. That's not what's happening here. I'm really only looking at religious affiliation and spirituality. But I just wanted to demonstrate rather the breadth of diversity in terms of how religion is approached throughout the literature, and encompass lots of different variables of interest. Now, in essence, what I think, or rather what I've distilled it down into, is that the study of religion encompasses group level differences between religious affiliations and individual level differences in religious identification. So that's how I see the study of religion broadly. We have these group level differences between religious between religious groups. So for example, the biggest one would be, is someone religious or are they not? And then you have other group level differences like between faiths or between denominations. And then you have individual level differences in religious identification in terms of, if a person identifies as religious, what does that mean to that person? And my work broadly taps into both of these ideas because I think they're both interesting, but I think the interesting part is the individual level differences. If we look at religion broadly, as well as look at some of the theory that explains how religion came to be and why it exists and what its importance is to society, some of this work, at least in my view, points to the idea that the intragroup differences in terms of religious identification is more important and valuable than that between religious identities. So religious groups, whatever they may be, may encompass broadly some of the same ideas. And so the interesting part lies within the individual level differences in terms of how they identify and why they identify as religious. So just to draw back to this particular presentation, there are two gaps in the literature I identified: the temporal ordering of religion and authoritarianism, which I've mentioned, and religion's countervailing associations with socio-political attitudes. And so for this particular research that I'm going to be showing you, it will be hopefully addressing both in a somewhat satisfactory way. So I'm going to be presenting 4 studies to you that I did for my thesis. 3 of the studies that I present have used data drawn from the New Zealand Attitudes and Values Study, the NZAVS, which Barbara mentioned. So this is a national longitudinal panel study that began in 2009. It's a really broad scope study. It includes an omnibus survey that is sent out to previous participants and randomly selected participants from the electoral roll every year. So we have quite a few people in this study. I can show you just some of the sample size stats for each year since it began. The last wave had 38,551. This is time 12. And has retained 38,345 participants from at least one previous wave. So this is a really valuable source of data in terms of assessing New Zealanders' political, religious values, whatever it is. There's all sorts of data that's gathered in the survey, and it was really fortunate that I had a chance to work on this data set. And there are some issues with it that we can talk about, but generally speaking, the NZAVS is representative of the New Zealand population. And there's just a huge data set to pull from. We have repeated measures across the years. Most of the measures that we look at in terms of demographic and socio-political variables are repeated. So that gave us a really good data pool to look at. So using this study, I first wanted to talk about the first gap that I identified in the literature, which was, what is the temporal ordering of religion and authoritarianism? And so what I'll do is I'll just briefly talk about each of the studies and what they contributed to one of these 2 themes. And then we can discuss, and then I'll wrap up with a discussion of the broad themes of the thesis as I found them, and then we can have a discussion afterwards. So study 1 was developed to assess the temporal ordering of religion on authoritarianism. We used longitudinal data on religious conversion, specifically conversion to Christianity, as we reasoned that conversion should either follow or precede changes in right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation. And so the aim of the study was to assess whether changes in authoritarianism or SDO preceded changes in religious identification. Now, some of you might be asking, why did we use Christianity, since there is a diversity of faith in New Zealand? And the problem was that the complexity of this model meant that, A, we didn't have a vast number of participants. So as you can see, we only had about 536 participants out of a sample size of tens of thousands, purely because the model that we employed restricted the sample size. It put too many constraints on the number of participants, on what participants had to fulfill, the criteria they had to fulfill in order to be included. So Christianity was the only religious identification that we were able to gather enough participants for this model to run, essentially. I did look at the second and third most populous religious identities in New Zealand, which are Hindu and Islam, I believe. But unfortunately, we just didn't have enough participants in those religious identities to be able to run this model. So Christianity was the one we chose. And the other thing is that this is further constrained by the fact that New Zealand is actually decreasingly religious. So census data since at least 2010 and other data as well has shown that religious identification is dropping in New Zealand. It's almost, I think it is a religious minority country in the sense that almost over half of the population no longer identifies as religious of any sort. So, or at least in terms of, yeah, they no longer identify as part of a religious group. So there is that puts a further constraint on the sample size of each of the religious groups. So as I said, this study was designed to assess the temporal ordering of religion on authoritarianism using conversion data. Now, what we did is we looked at we looked at the sample from ×2 to 10, and we picked out participants who had provided at least one pre-conversion and one post-conversion data point. So they had to have identified as non-religious at some point during their participation in the study, and then during that time, they would have had to convert or become a Christian identifier. And then for the duration of their time in the study, they had to remain Christian, which does cut out some of the religious switching, but unfortunately, it's just the way that the model constraint had to work. So once we had participants who had provided at least one pre-conversion and one post-conversion data point, we were able to conduct an event-centered piecewise latent growth model. And I don't want to bore people with the statistics. I will mention briefly what a piecewise latent growth model is, but basically what this allows us to do is it allows us to chart levels of right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, both before and after people convert. So in terms of how we assessed some of the stuff, so Christianity was assessed through self-report. We analyzed those who converted to Christianity from a non-religious affiliation and stayed Christian. So this is just the item that we used. You know, do you identify with a religion and or spiritual group? And then if yes, what religion? Now, in terms of a latent growth curve and what an event-centered piecewise latent growth curve is, very, very basically, latent growth curves use repeated measures to assess latent trajectories. So essentially, you take a bunch of repeated measures and you're able to chart their growth or decline. And what a piecewise latent growth model does is that it simply subdivides the repeated measures at a point in time. Now, normally this is chronological. So you might have a cohort and you might say, okay, after a certain point, at a certain point, we're going to subdivide this, and then we're going to examine growth before and after this particular point in chronological time. Maybe it's after an election or whatever it is. But in this case, because we're actually interested in conversion, and conversion is not going to happen for every participant at the same point in time, we had to center that subdivision on the specific event of conversion. So what that basically means is that time points were developed based on years prior and post-conversion. And participants would contribute differently to each time point dependent on when they entered the study and when they converted. So this is confusing. So hopefully that this little example makes it a little bit clearer. Basically, imagine you're a participant and you enter the study at time 2. So there's already been 1 year of data that's collected, you're entering at time 2. And you are non-religious at this point in time. So you fill out your survey and you send it back, and you do so for the next 3 years. And then for the next 2 years. And then at time 5, you decide you want to become religious. You're still filling in the survey. You've just decided at some point during the year between time 4 and time 5, you've come to identify as religious, specifically Christian. So what that would mean is that time point, that year, when you converted, whenever you converted in that year, is now the change point. So you've got 3 pre-conversion data points, and say you continue for 1 more year before you leave the study, you've got 2 post-conversion data points, you see? So we have 3 pre-conversion, 2 post-conversion, and your change point is between, well, it doesn't actually matter when your change point is. It just matters that you've got 3 pre-conversion and 2 post-conversion data points. And then what these do is these feed into our broader overall model. And so for every participant, that is what's happening to their data. We look at when they entered the data, when they entered the sample. Well, it actually doesn't matter when they entered the sample. We look at basically how much data they contributed to before they converted and then after they converted. And as long as they have 1 pre and 1 post-conversion point, they're included in the model. And then slowly that builds up until we have a whole model. And what that does mean is because participants are less likely to stay for a long period of time, particularly because you would expect there would be some religious switching. So people aren't going to convert and then stay Christian for a long period of time. What you see is that there is a small number of participants who are contributing large amounts of data pre-deconversion, as well as a small number of participants who are contributing post-deconversion, and a much larger group of people who are providing at least 1 pre-conversion and 1 post-conversion data point. So we see 536 participants for 1 pre-conversion and the same for 1 post-conversion. And then we can see that 41 participants are providing at least 6 waves of data before they convert, and 62 participants are providing at least 6 waves of data after they convert. So what this means is that because of the model specification, we had different sample sizes at each time point, which may be of interest to people. But ultimately, the point is that we were able to construct our latent growth models for both pre and post conversion. So what we did is first we looked at religious conversion and right-wing authoritarianism. Did changes in authoritarianism precede or follow changes in religious identification? And what we can see is that it seems that there was a change after people converted to Christianity. For the initial slope, we see no significant incline or decrease. Participants weren't changing authoritarianism prior to becoming Christian. After they identified as Christian, we see a slight but significant increase in levels of authoritarianism. Now, there's no significant jump between these 2 time points, so it's not that people are becoming Christian and then suddenly they're realizing that they're actually quite like authoritarian ideals. It just seems to be a slow enculturation as a result of exposure to religious beliefs. So what this seems to indicate then is that the enculturation effect may be going on here. We can't say definitively, of course, because this isn't causal, but we can see that there seems to be some sort of temporal ordering where it seems that religious change is preceding changes in authoritarian ideals. Now, because the other part of my research is also looking at the effect of social dominance orientation and, in terms of conservative identification and such, we also looked at whether religious conversion preceded or changed increases in SDO or not, or decreases. So what we might expect is, because of some of the literature that I've outlined, religious conversion would precede or follow, at least, a decline in social dominance orientation. But strangely enough, we didn't find that at all. Across both pre-conversion and post-conversion slopes, we see no significant increase or decline in social dominance orientation. So not sure what's going on there, but essentially it seems that the effect of religious conversion is limited to an increase in RWA. So what these results showed is that conversion to a religious, specifically Christian affiliation temporally preceded slight but significant increases in authoritarianism. And that these processes were specific to RWA. So analyses focusing on SDO found that religious conversion did not precede changes to converts' preference for group-based hierarchy. So future research could examine the mechanisms underlying this relationship, as well as whether these effects replicate across faiths. And that was some of the research that I was interested in, was the mechanisms that might underlie this relationship. Particularly why we found no delineation between why we found no decline in SDO. So study 2 was aimed to assess the downstream effects of religion on conservatism through RWA and STO, with a particular eye towards looking at conceptually replicating some of the past work that has been done on religion and spirituality, and also to demonstrate that by delineating between religion and spirituality, we can show this hypothesized countervailing effect of religion on conservatism. So whilst conversion didn't seem to show that that delineation, that effect of that countervailing effect rather, we hoped that by delineating between religion and spirituality, we could show that there is a countervailing effect, broadly speaking, of religion on conservative ideology. So for study 2, we analyzed 7,417 participants from time 8 of the New Zealand Attitudes and Values study. Time 8 was used as this was the first time that spiritual identification was assessed. And this study focused on measures of religiosity, spirituality, authoritarianism, SDO, etc. Now, study 2 looked at religious identification using a Lockhart scale, specifically how important is religion to how you see yourself, and spiritual identification in a very similar way. I identify as a spiritual person. We also included political identity centrality. And the reason why we included this was because past work has indicated that political engagement, so like exposure to media or whatever, should moderate the effect of religion and other variables on conservative/political identification. And what we wanted to see was whether or not political identity centrality as a proxy of political engagement would show this, would moderate this relationship between religion and conservatism, as well as spirituality and conservatism. We included a number of covariates which aren't of interest, which I outlined there, but yeah, I'm not sure of particular interest, but broadly, this is what the model looked like. So it looked complicated, but briefly, what we were attempting to show was that there is a countervailing relationship between religion and spirituality on conservatism. And this is through RWA and SDO, respectively. And what we can see is that there do seem to be these two independent pathways as hypothesized. So religiosity is positively associated with RWA in this model. And by extension, by contrast, spirituality is negatively associated with SDO. Moreover, the effect of, RWA and SDO indirectly mediate the effect, religion is indirectly positively correlated with conservatism through RWA, and spirituality is indirectly negatively correlated with conservatism through SDO. So as you can see, religion and spirituality do not directly predict conservatism, but it's through this indirect relationship. So what we see also is that political centrality moderates the effects of RWA and SDO on conservatism, which is consistent with some of the past work, but that political centrality did not moderate the effect of religion on RWA. So this is interesting because what that seems to indicate then is that the relationship between religion and RWA is so strong that it's not moderated by political engagement / centrality. So it just seems to be this conceptual connection that religious people are making with authoritarianism. And when we reflect on study 1, that seems to indicate then that people who are joining religion are just intuitively making the connection between their newfound religious beliefs and authoritarian ideals. It's just a natural progression to adopt authoritarian beliefs. So that seems to indicate that conversion is that religion is the prior effect, essentially. It's the root of authoritarian ideals. It's a natural connection that people are making. Interestingly enough, when we look at the effect of political centrality on the relationship between spirituality and SDO, we see that there is actually an effect. It does moderate the relationship between spirituality and SDO. So what this seems to indicate then is that the spirituality-SDO relationship was stronger for those high on political identity centrality relative to those who were low on it. And I can show you the moderations if they're of interest. Essentially what we see here is with this middle one, we see that low spiritual identification and high political centrality is showing that stronger connection with social dominance orientation. Whereas low spiritual identification and low political centrality, we're seeing a slightly weaker connection with social dominance orientation. So for spirituality, unlike religion, it seems that political engagement is really important to making that connection between one's spiritual beliefs and political attitudes as reflected in SDO, which is again an egalitarian or an anti-egalitarian political attitude or ideology. So what we're seeing from this work then is we're establishing, hopefully, a temporal ordering relationship, or at least giving some ideas about what the temporal ordering might be, which seems to be the effect of religion on authoritarian attitudes. And then we're seeing the downstream effects of religion on conservative ideology, specifically through this countervailing relationship between RWA and SDO. And vital as well is that we delineate between religion and spirituality as two different aspects of religious identification or belief, as they have differing outcomes, essentially. Now, I just want to briefly mention as well that religion and spirituality are not equal partners, I suppose, in predicting conservatism. What we see here is that religion has a much stronger indirect effect on conservative ideology than spirituality does. And so when we look more broadly at religion, we're not seeing this countervailing effect because religion's positive impact on conservatism through RWA is washing out the spiritual effect, the effect of spirituality on conservatism through lower endorsement of SDO. So there's definitely an imbalance there, but we can see that there is a countervailing effect. It's just often washed out by the positive effect of religion on RWA and consequently conservatism. Now, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I've got 2 more studies to present, so hopefully we have
as much as you want, Chris.
Oh, okay, good, great. Now,
there's some time for questions until 11, okay?
Okay, great. So I just want to, for this next study, study 3, I'm going to go off in a slightly different direction. And actually these next 2 studies take more of a, they go off in a slightly different direction in the sense that we have this understanding, and a lot of the literature is focused on different ways of examining religion, different ways of examining spirituality, and then how it relates to things like RWA, SDO, and political identification. And that's all well and good. But how does this play out in terms of broader, more varied socio-political outcomes? And this study in particular, which I conducted not actually using NZAVS data, it was using a different data set, which I'll mention briefly, looks at the indigenous population of New Zealand. Now, what I was interested in is, does the expression of spirituality cross to other cultures? So the indigenous peoples of New Zealand, Māori people, they've been in New Zealand since the 14th century or something like that. And New Zealand and European New Zealanders have only come over in the last 200 years or so. Now, there has been this contentious relationship between European and indigenous New Zealanders in the sense that because of colonization, essentially. And what I'm driving at here is that New Zealand Māori have a spiritual belief that precedes like Western conceptions of spirituality, although Western conceptions of spirituality were introduced into New Zealand when it was colonized. Nonetheless, what's of interest is that because New Zealand Māori still maintain a lot of traditional beliefs, and those beliefs and those rights in terms of their status and their association with the land are still maintained today, does Māori spirituality have similar conceptual and empirical overlap with some of the work that we've been talking about in terms of spirituality? Moreover, is Māori spirituality a possible explanation for why Māori hold such deep regard for the environment? So some of you remember I talked about universalism as a value, orientation, which is related to the sort of sense of connection between oneself and outgroups, including nature. So do Māori have the strong sense of connection with the environment because of this sort of value of connecting with nature, essentially? And so that was the question here. It was also, this paper was also contextualized in the sense that that Māori have struggled in New Zealand for recognition of their rights, and Māori rights to the land and their socio-political beliefs that are associated with the land are very much based on traditional beliefs to do with stewardship and their status as guardians of the land, as people of the land, because the other name for Māori, tangata whenua, is literally means people of the land. So Māori have a deep connection with the environment, with New Zealand, through this idea of, first of all, their identification as tangata whenua, people of the land, but also this idea of kaitiakitanga. So that is te reo for stewardship. Te reo is the language of, is the Māori language. So Māori identify as kaitiaki, which is a legal status in New Zealand, and it reflects their rights as the guardians and stewards of the land. And kaitiakitanga is the broader sociocultural framework by which Māori hold stewardship over the land, and there's a sense of reciprocity and spiritual obligation to the land, and vice versa. So what kaitiakitanga reflects is the socio-political and spiritual concerns that Māori have regarding the land. It connotes a reciprocal relationship with the land and a sense of obligation to one's habitat and community. And it acknowledges the rights of Māori over the land and its importance to tino rangatiratanga, which basically means sovereignty. So Māori sovereignty was essentially crushed during colonization, and there has been this ongoing movement in New Zealand for Māori to regain some of their autonomy and agency and sovereignty that was lost to them during the process of colonization. And so what I want to emphasize here is that Māori have a strong connection to the land because of sociocultural reasons, because the land is power, essentially. The land is power, it's agency for Māori, and it's power that was taken away from them, 200 years ago. And for many Māori, kaitiakitanga is the socio-political obligation to reclaim some of that land so that Māori can once again have the agency that was taken from them during colonization. Now, this may sound like it's a little bit divergent from some of the work that I've been talking about, but that's because I haven't addressed the spiritual role of kaitiakitanga. So stewardship, Māori stewardship of the land is not just a socio-political concern, it is also deeply rooted in spiritual beliefs. And so this was the part that I was particularly interested in when I was looking at this study. So Māori are kaitiaki, they're stewards of the land, and this is rooted not only in concern for the power of the land and agency and such, but it's also deeply rooted in the spiritual significance of the land to Māori. So Māori identity is rooted in the spiritual belief that Māori are descendants of the land. There is a cosmological belief that Māori come from the earth, essentially, from the union of the earth and the sky, and that as such, Māori are children of the land, as reflected by the tangata whenua title, tangata whenua description. And because they are children of the land, they have an obligation to look after the land in terms of spiritual reciprocity. So there is actually a very interesting quote about how it's actually aired in New Zealand Airlines right now, currently, that Māori believe that the land is not inherited from ancestors, but it's borrowed from children. So there is a substantial sort of religious philosophy that underlies these Māori land customs, and it's predicated on this sense of temporal relationship between ancestors and offspring, and a shared ancestry with all aspects of the environment. So this shared ancestry is particularly important. It's known as whakapapa, which essentially means genealogy. And so Māori have this deeply spiritual belief that everything is connected, everything is an offspring of the sort of cosmological creators. And because of that, Māori have an obligation to look after the land, because the land is essentially akin to them. It's like a cousin or it's a family member. So what this reflects is a sense of universal connection with nature and with humanity. And it highlights the importance of being part of nature rather than being masters of it. So in terms of the study itself, with that little preface out of the way, we analyzed 6,812 participants from the Māori Identity and Financial Attitudes Study, the MIFAS. So very similar to the NZAVS, except it hasn't been running continuously for the last 12 or so years. The MIFAS is a study that looks at a variety of demographic, socio-political, and financial variables, and it is specific for Māori. So Māori are recruited across the nation using the post to partake in this study. Now, what this means is that the Māori people who tend to respond to this sort of role, to the sort of survey, are sometimes more urbanized than perhaps other iwi, other tribes of Māori throughout the nation. But generally, the MIFAS is as largely representative of Māori communities. Now, what we found is that, what we did is we looked at a slightly smaller number of participants, just because there were a couple of hundred participants who didn't respond to some of the measures that we were interested in. And we were interested in whether Māori identity, specifically Māori spirituality, was associated with valuing the environment. So we looked at emic measures of Māori identity, which have been derived from past work. The multidimensional measure of Māori identity and cultural engagement is a measure that has been designed to provide an emic measure of Māori identity, and it encapsulates variables such as Māori spirituality and Māori socio-political consciousness. And then we use Schwartz's values, which were also included in the MIFAS, as our outcome variables. So we wanted to see whether Māori would endorse the specific environmental values of protecting the environment, preserving the environment, and uniting with nature, or fitting in with nature. Now, I just want to draw people's attention first to the Māori identities scale. So there have been attempts in the past to examine Māori identity, and a problem has been that Māori identity was fragmented following colonization. But this measure, which was developed to assess Māori identity, has come pretty close to identifying some of the important variables of that underpin Māori identification. Now, the ones that we're interested in specifically are Māori spirituality. So these are things like the extent to which a person perceives, these are things like the extent to which a person is engaged with their taha wairua and has a belief in Māori concepts of spirituality. And then the other variable of interest, which is highlighted there, is Māori socio-political consciousness. So I just want to mention that spirituality and socio-political consciousness form the two underpinnings of the philosophy that Māori hold regarding their connection to the land. So I mentioned it before, Māori hold that the connection to the land is rooted in the philosophical concerns of seeking agency and authority and sovereignty, because the land has that sort of power. And also Māori have this connection to the land because of their spiritual beliefs. Now, socio-political consciousness as an aspect of Māori identity is essentially tapping into that first one. It's tapping into that idea of reclaiming Māori agency, which was lost because of colonization. So what it basically encapsulates are things like, I stand up for Māori rights, and I think that Māori have been wronged in the past, and that we should stand up for, and that Māori should stand up for what is theirs, essentially. And it is very much tied into this recognition that Māori were treated unfairly because of essentially because there wasn't an equal partnership between Māori and the colonial powers that landed in New Zealand, and there was some attempt to create an equal partnership. There was a treaty that was signed by the Crown of England and the Māori tribes, but because of various either misunderstandings or willful misinterpretations, the treaty that was signed was often not the one that was actually enforced by the Crown. And so it came to be that the treaty acted as sort of a cover for a problematic attempt at colonization, which robbed Māori of a lot of land and a lot of power, a lot of agency rather. So the other aspect, of course, is Māori spirituality. And these are things like, I believe that tupuna or ancient ancestors can communicate with you if they want to, as well as I can feel sometimes my Māori ancestors watching over me. So these are things that tie Māori to the sort of temporal understanding of ancestors and offspring, as well as to this broader connection between the self and nature. Now, as I mentioned, we simply did a correlation between Māori spirituality and Māori socio-political consciousness, and whether or not it was related to these specific values that govern interest in the environment, essentially. So what we can see here is that socio-political consciousness was strongly associated with protecting the environment, this idea of preserving nature, which would make sense because we would expect that socio-political consciousness, recognizing the importance of the land in pursuit of Māori well-being and sovereignty, is associated with this idea of preserving the land and protecting it. And of course, socio-political consciousness was the strongest predictor of this value of protecting the environment, contrasted with all of the other aspects of Māori identity. Now, in terms of which variables of interest predicted unity with nature, which is distinct as a variable, as a value from protecting the environment, rather than preserving, unity with nature deals with things like fitting in with nature, feeling part of it, essentially. Spirituality, which underpins this idea of interconnectedness between Māori and the environment and just a holistic view of the world, was the strongest predictor of valuing unity with nature. And so what we can see here is that essentially spirituality and socio-political consciousness seem to show two distinct, well, not distinct necessarily, but show two different pathways which underpin this idea of Māori environmental regard through these two different values of protecting the environment and uniting with nature. And they're both important, but they're both important for different reasons. So that was study 3, which essentially showed broadly that yes, spirituality amongst Māori is very important to predicting environmental regard, and that it predicts a specific kind of environmental regard for Māori in terms of predicting this idea of wanting to fit in with nature. And so what this seems to indicate broadly is that there might be some consistencies across cultures between and in terms of how cultures perceive and conceptualize spirituality as a sort of universal connection between self and outgroup and particular nature. And for Māori, this is very rooted in the sociocultural context of agency and a belief in a cosmological creator. So finally, for study 4, I was interested in, and this is again another sort of divergence from some of the past literature, I was interested in the countervailing associations. I went back to the idea that there are these countervailing associations between religion, with regard to how religion predicts variables of interest. Now, so what we see is that previous studies had examined religion and spirituality, as well as the countervailing associations. But in this one, I wanted to examine individual differences in terms of motivations for religious identification, which and its impacts on intergroup attitudes. And I was moving away from environmental environmental outcomes. And this time I was looking at an intergroup relations regarding sexism. So specifically, I was interested in the effect of religious narcissism as a predictor of sexism. Now, I was interested in sexism because religion's impact on sexism has been quite muddled in the literature. So some work has suggested that religion positively predicts both hostile and benevolent sexism, others only benevolent sexism, and some suggest that religion has negative associations with hostile sexism and even benevolent sexism. And the other aspect of interest for me was the idea of differential motivations for religious identification. So religious narcissism was a good example to tap into this because it draws parallels with this idea of a sort of intrinsic extrinsic belief while still rooting it in a more in a sort of social group fashion anyway. So yeah, it draws parallels to this idea of intrinsic extrinsic beliefs, but it is it's more motivational, I suppose, and it's an interesting and new aspect of the literature. So also the other thing is that I was interested in whether religion might have a direct impact on sexism beyond authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, because past work has suggested that religion explains little variance in sexism when accounting for both RWA and SDO, and yet other research has shown that that might not be the case. So religious narcissism might be a predictor of sexism, and it might demonstrate this countervailing association again that I think exists more broadly in terms of religion's associations with socio-political outcomes. So what I did was I analyzed over 1,000 participants from times 3.5 and times 4 of the New Zealand Attitudes and Values study. And the reason why these were selected is simply because these were the variables, these were the times where our variables of interest were measured. And we looked at measures of religious identification and religious group narcissism. So just to explain religious group narcissism and religious group narcissism for people unfamiliar, religious group narcissism is essentially this idea that people are likely to identify with their religious group because it helps to ameliorate concerns about their sense of control over life and a sense of vulnerability that they have, essentially. As part of a broader theory on collective narcissism, it's tied to this idea of collective self-esteem, but it proposes that people will essentially tie their self-identity with a religious group, or with a group in general rather, because they want to bolster their sense of self by engaging in what is sort of like classically narcissistic activity. They project an enhanced self-image. They try and make other people feel, other people acknowledge that their group is great, is better than any other group, whatever, right? And it all stems from this feeling of powerlessness and lack of control. And so they need to bolster that sort of sense of self-esteem by essentially by trying to get other people to admit that their group is amazing. And a vital part of that is that when people don't admit that their group is amazing, or they just don't care, then religious narcissists or group narcissists perceive that as a slight. They have a hypersensitivity to criticism, and they react very badly to criticism of their group. Even if it's the most benign form of criticism, they will react very negatively to that. So this seems to show some forms of some correlations rather with this, some conceptual overlap with this idea of benevolent and hostile sexism. So benevolent sexism, for those unfamiliar, is the idea that women are put on a pedestal and they are seen as the purer sex, as the better sex, essentially, and that women need to be looked after by men. And it essentially robs women of agency through a paternalistic sort of framework. Hostile sexism is the opposite to that. It sees women as attempting to control men, as malignant, as hostile, as cold, and it is essentially the stick to the carrot that is benevolent sexism. if women are to conform to specific gender roles, then benevolent sexism offers, the rewards for that, whereas hostile sexism, is essentially the threat. And of course, both essentially rob women of agency, casting women as, either warm but incompetent, or cold but, or competent but cold. So this connection with religious narcissism is related to this idea that hostile sexism has this overperception of threat as well, where any deviance from traditional gender norms is punished by hostile sexism, and similarly as well by benevolent sexism. So what I was interested in was whether or not religious identification would predict benevolent and hostile sexism differently from religious group narcissism, and whether by delineating between religious group narcissism as a sort of insecure form of group identification rooted in a lack of power and a sense of powerlessness would be different from religious identification, which statistically should just contain the variance which is to do with secure identification. So things like, I identify with the group because I actually genuinely like the group, rather than using it to shield from my own feelings of inadequacy. So, and we also included social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism to see whether or not religious narcissism would explain variance beyond these important measures of intergroup attitudes. So we conducted 3 models. The first one looked at the effect of religious identification on—
Christopher,
Yes.
I would like to remind you that it's 11:15, so maybe if you've got 5 minutes to wrap up, we are okay here to stay past 11. If there are things to discuss, it's just for you to know what time it is.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm almost done. So yeah, thanks. So just very quickly, the first model looked at religious identification on hostile and benevolent sexism, and we found that there was no significant predictor. We found that religious narcissism was a positive predictor of both hostile and benevolent sexism. And interestingly, when we included both religious identification and group narcissism in our model, we found that religious group narcissism positively predicted hostile and benevolent sexism, whereas this sort of secure form of religious identification seemed to negatively predict both hostile and benevolent sexism. So this seems to suggest that maybe the countervailing effects might not just be from religion and spirituality, but from these more motivational approaches to religious identification. All right. So broadly, the main findings: study 1 showed that conversion to a religious Christian affiliation temporally preceded slight but significant increases in RWA. Study 2 showed as the downstream effects that religion and spirituality have divergent outcomes on conservatism through both RWA and SDO. And taken together, studies 1 and 2 show a clear pathway between religion and socio-political attitudes, where it seems that religion temporally precedes these sort of socio-political attitudes, and then these socio-political attitudes have effects on conservatism, essentially, and that there is this countervailing effect. Study 3 demonstrated that Māori spirituality was associated with universalist values, particularly a desire to unite with nature, partially explaining Māori environmental attitudes and showing that there is some sort of cross-cultural relevance in terms of spirituality. Studies 1 to 3 collectively demonstrate the importance of religion in motivating socio-political outcomes, with the impacts of religion and spirituality mediated by certain values. Finally, study 4 demonstrated that insecure versus secure forms of religious identification showed countervailing associations with ambivalent sexism. And importantly, such work showed that religious narcissism predicted increases in ambivalent sexism independently of both RWA and SDO. So in terms of the broad themes that I outlined at the beginning, in terms of the temporal ordering and countervailing effects, what we see for temporal ordering is that religion appears to precede changes in socio-political attitudes, increasing authoritarianism, and this provides evidence towards this idea of a temporal ordering, but definitely more work would be needed. So what I didn't mention is that, just because of time, is that study 1 also showed a selection effect in terms of deconversion. This was participants who were religious, but then deconverted to a non-religious affiliation. And we also examined those relationships and found suggestions of a selection effect. So this suggests that there might be some sort of bidirectional effect in terms of the temporal ordering, but there certainly seems to be some something going on there regarding religion preceding changes in authoritarianism. Finally, in terms of the countervailing effects, studies 2 to 4 were broadly within this theme, showing that there are countervailing effects of religious identification on socio-political attitudes such as conservative affiliation, environmental attitudes, and ambivalent sexism, and that these effects are motivated by individual differences in religious identification. So just going back to this idea of there being group level and individual level differences, I think that the impactful part is the individual level differences. And study 4 also showed that the motivational underpinnings of religious identification, specifically secure versus insecure in-group positivity, can have countervailing effects. So broadly, socio-political outcomes of religious belief are very complex. And I hope to continue researching in this area because I find it highly interesting. And I hope you guys found it insightful and useful. Just a big thank you to the NZAVS research team for their help, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much, Christopher. I think it was really complex what you presented. Thanks again for being here, for being our host. And now I would like to open the discussion session. That means that anybody who's willing to comment or ask any questions, please raise your hand using the reactions button there, so that I can see anybody who's willing to join the discussion and then go ahead. Okay, Miro Popper, I can see that you would like to discuss.
Okay, do you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you, but can you turn on your camera so that Christopher can see you?
Yes, of course.
Thanks.
Okay, so first of all, Christopher, thank you very much for an interesting and thought-provoking presentation that pointed out various aspects of religion and conservatism. And I am very interested regarding study 1 to know if you have also considered the opposite possibility, which means to test how RWA and SDO change in people who were Christians and converted to non-believers, as these would, in my opinion, probably provide a more comprehensive and convincing picture of authoritarianism and social dominance.
Yeah. So that was actually part of the paper. Unfortunately, I didn't present it today just because, because of time. I thought that I had it timed well, but I realized I've actually gone over time even by excluding those slides. So, but I can show you those slides actually, if that's of interest to people regarding the effect of religious deconversion and
Yes, please.
So what we can see here in terms of religious deconversion is, and it sort of talks to that selection effect I was talking about, which I briefly alluded to, but I didn't go into depth. We see that when people deconvert from a Christian identification to a non-religious identification and stay non-religious, they show a significant decline in levels of authoritarianism prior to their change of religious affiliation. And then for some reason, when they do change, we see that there is a much flatter slope in terms of their decline. So they're still declining, but then declining less significant, like less rapidly, essentially. And there's also this this jump between their point of deconversion and their point of pre-deconversion and their point of post-deconversion. I can't remember whether or not that's significant. I don't think it is. It looks significant, but I'm pretty sure it's not. Or maybe it is. I'd have to double check, I'm sorry. But broadly, what this seems to suggest is that there's some sort of reactance effect going on where people who are part of a religious institution are hearing the sort of authoritarian dogma or whatever it is, and they're actively rebelling against it almost. And then after a certain period of time, they might realize that the religion isn't suitable for them. And so they change to a non-religious affiliation. And so then there's a slightly less significant, there's a significant but slightly less steep, I suppose, decline in levels of authoritarianism after that fact. And that was my hypothesis anyway, but I welcome people's thoughts on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I saw Gabriel Bianchi raised his hand. So Gabo, you can go, and afterwards, Barbara.
Hello, hello. Thank you very much. I would say very dense presentation, and I would definitely need to read the papers before understanding completely all the details, starting from study 2. But anyway, I still have some questions because it's very inspirational what you presented here. And well, I have sort of critical reflection. Sorry for be critical, but take it in a good way as inspiration for further improvements. First, I feel a little bit annoyed by the word religion, because you are talking just about Christianity and then about Maori, of course, but in the religious sense, you just concern on Christianity. So I would appreciate having it like because there can be you can call Hinduism and Buddhism also religions, yeah. And I would be very curious what would be the data with Buddhism and Hinduism. And my intuitive expectation is that the data would be very different from the Christianity data. So it's the title is for me extremely confusing, the general title. And then also I have a problem to understand your 3 steps from spirituality through faith to religiosity, because in the second step, in the faith, you defined faith as identification with those religion complex already. And in my understanding, you say spirituality is the general connection with humankind, yeah, the universalism. Okay, yes, that's fine. But faith can be even without a God. It does not necessarily have to be God. What people believe in, yeah, and we did a lot of research on religiosity and faithfulness, and people say, I just believe in some higher principle, and it does not concern the humanitarian benevolence and universalism. It just concerns just wisdom, just some authority above, and not in the form of a God. So I disagree with your definition of faith being reserved for identification with the religion. And of course, all of your research is concerned on quantitative data, but it gives me an itching feeling that, for example, if you take just the period of the conversion before and after, yeah, so 1 year before and 1 year or 2 years after, or deconversion, which is even more interesting, as Miro pointed to, so you are losing completely the contextual information on the subject of the people, because it's not the question of that point that I convert to some religion. It happens in a contextual environment where I'm a subject of influences from the culture, from other people, from social groups, from normative environment, etc. And why and how it comes to this transformation, let's say, of the subjectivity to the religious or back to the non-religious is, in my approach, absolutely necessary to approach in a qualitative way, how to simply to talk with the people and to identify the influences, the reasons for the transformation, and not just to notice that it has happened in this year and chuck, yeah. It's not like replacing a flat tire on a car. But in your approach, very, very sophisticated quantitative data management, it looks like it would be a sort of replacing a flat tire on a car. So sorry for being critical. I like your presentation very much, and I would love to read it in detail and to understand more in detail those predictions you are making in the study 2 and especially in study 4. So thank you very much for being with us. That was very, very inspiring. Thank you. And,
Yeah,
also,
thank you.
and also because I was involved in the study with Caprara and Schwartz before on religion and political preferences. So it's very close to my experience. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. Yeah, definitely. I definitely think that so yeah, when it comes to what faith means, like that's, for me, that was just how I perceived it, but I could definitely see that faith for some people would be more of a, like a broad idea of, you know, a higher power and nothing specific in terms of a specific religious affiliation. Maybe I should have termed that religious affiliation then. I mean, that's not particularly relevant because I didn't really think about those definitions in terms of my work. Just they were more like broad musings, I suppose, when it was coming to writing my thesis about what the multidimensionality of religion would look like. But yeah, like for example, in New Zealand, I say it's a non-religious country, and that is what has typically been thought of as it's a religious minority country, but it's actually not, kind of.
Yeah, so sorry, and therefore conversion in a non-religious country has a complex, different meaning than a conversion like in Slovakia, okay, where you by conversion you get part of the majority. And
yeah.
In Australia, in New Zealand, it's getting out of the majority. It's sort of getting to a weird minority. Okay, so
Yeah.
So the context is for me absolutely crucial.
Yeah, definitely, and that's such an interesting point. Yeah, about conversion, because it's definitely against the grain almost, because if the norm in New Zealand is not to be non-religious, which is questionable, you know, because there are a substantial number of people in New Zealand who identify as believing in a higher power, even if they don't necessarily.
That's the faith. That's the
yeah,
faith.
would be faith, right? But and then New Zealand was founded as a Christian. Well, it was founded by missionaries, basically. So sorry, it was colonized by missionaries. It wasn't founded by missionaries. So it was colonized by missionaries. So there is definitely that Christian element to it, which is part of our history, and we can't deny that. And it's just going to have influence. And in fact, when colonization was happening, Māori, a fair number of Māori communities incorporated Christianity within their own faith and syncretized it into like a very complex religion that sort of incorporates both Christian ideals, but also like traditional Māori beliefs. So in terms of whether or not New Zealand is like it's like a religious country, there is still remnants of Christianity's influence in terms of the indigenous peoples of New Zealand themselves, some of whom have held on to traditional beliefs by interweaving them with Christianity that was brought over by the missionaries. But I definitely take your point, and I think it's very interesting about that idea that it's against the grain, and so the motivations are so very different. Yeah, because a lot of the literature I reviewed in terms of conversion and the experience of conversion, some of it from like theologians and such, was very much in that context of, I identify, they come to convert, for a variety of different reasons, and that may not match onto the New Zealand experience. So yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Such very good points. Yeah, very interesting points.
I could see that Barbara was very eager to ask something or say, so just go ahead. We can't hear you because you're on mute, Barbara.
Okay, sorry. So I had several questions, like very minor ones, but I thank Gabriel for this comment about the context, which is very important, the normative context of everything. But I think that basically the fact that New Zealand is a non-religious country predominantly provides even a stronger, like it is even a better test of your hypothesis, right, about the enculturation into religion. So because it would be completely different in Slovakia, where people are like bombarded by religious norms and messages and values. So I think that like it's a better environment for you to test the hypothesis you tested. And I really love the presentation. Thank you very much for that. And I have two very different and minor questions. The first one is, did you measure also other outcomes, like when testing the role of religions, for example, such as intergroup attitudes? because I was very much in, or intergroup solidarity, because I was very much interested in that pro-sociality hypothesis that might work very differently. So do you have any data on religiousness and intergroup attitudes or solidarity or other intergroup outcomes we are interested in particular? That's the first question, and then I will ask the two other.
Yeah. So I mean, the only specific part to intergroup attitudes was that examination of hostile and benevolent sexism. Okay. But I do think that there is some data. So that was the only part that I particularly looked at. But I imagine there must be some data looking at, for example, religious influences on, you know, how people perceive intergroup relationships, like, for example, with Māori. So actually, this is becoming, so we have an election next year in 2023, and there is an increasing discussion, at least I've perceived in the public, about this idea of how Pākehā, how European New Zealanders interact with Māori, and what sort of rights will be afforded to Māori going on in the future, because there has been a general trend in New Zealand politics towards an acceptance of Māori as caretakers of the land and as having, you know, specific rights as the indigenous peoples of New Zealand. But there is also a general increase in, at least this year, I feel like there has been an increase in the rhetoric about questioning those sorts of rights, and about whether or not what we call co-governance, which essentially positions Māori as equal partners with the government in terms of how land is looked after and how Māori are governed, specifically Māori, because Māori are overrepresented in prisons and overrepresented in healthcare issues in New Zealand. So there is urgency when it comes to Māori for their rights, for their needs to be addressed. But there is an increasing question. There is increasing people who are questioning what role Māori play in terms of this co-governance arrangement, whether or not co-governance is actually important. And so there might be religious ideas behind that. Like, a lot of the rhetoric has been around democracy and this idea that it's somehow undemocratic for Māori to be treated as equal partners with European New Zealanders. But there definitely could be other aspects going on that I would be particularly interested in looking at.
Because I was in particular, I love very much the distinction you make between secure and insecure forms of religious identification, and those might really played some role in intergroup attitudes. And in particular, I would be really interested in LGBT in attitudes for LGBTQ+, because this is really what we are living by these days after the murder of these two young queer men. And thank you so much for your answer, Chris. And the other question I had was about the kaitiaki. Sorry for the pronunciation, because you mentioned that it's a sort of legal status. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to know how it translates into practice, or how does it look like in practice? How is it implemented in policies or whatever?
Yeah. So kaitiaki is like the legal status. I'm not sure when it was established as a legal status. It might be with the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal. So the Waitangi, very brief New Zealand history. When the colonial powers came over, there was a treaty signed. That treaty wasn't properly enforced. Well, actually, that treaty was really not enforced at all. And it was basically used as a cover for the English government, for the Crown to seize vast tracts of land, and then all this other mess happened. Basically, in the 70s or something like that, maybe the 80s, there was a tribunal that was set up. It's like a court that was meant to interpret the treaty and make sure that it's essentially how it wasn't enforced and how it should be, how reparations should be made, because of the fact that it wasn't enforced. And as part of that, there was a recognition, I think it was during that time, that there was a recognition that Māori as tangata whenua are the kaitiaki of the land. And so the general trend since like the 70s or 80s has been for the government to incorporate what they call treaty policies, sort of like treaty principles into policy. And for greater negotiation with iwi, the tribes of New Zealand, regarding what to do about land and what to do about native species and native flora and fauna, and especially in the face of climate change. And there's been an increase, so that's been part of this recognition legally of Māori as kaitiaki, is this increasing engagement by people like the Department of Conservation and such, to try and, you know, solve problems together. In fact, I think there is now an establishment of in Canterbury, in the South Island, there is now like certain seats on some environmental board that are allocated for members of the iwi down here, Ngāi Tahu. So the tribe down here, the Māori tribe down here, Ngāi Tahu, who have who have, I think, guaranteed seats on this environmental board, because there is a recognition that Māori are the most impacted, well, not the most, but yeah, the most impacted when it comes to the, or at least disproportionately impacted when it comes to the to environmental degradation, because for Māori, connection with the land is so important to their sense of identity, and it's something that for many Māori engage in frequently. They go out fishing, or they go out and they live in the forests or whatever it is, and spend time in forests and such, and the land of their ancestors and such. And so that is sort of how kaitiaki is expressed as a legal framework, is within this framework of co-governance.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that makes sense. Sorry.
That's super interesting. And the third question was very boring one about measurement. And it was basically about how you measure religious narcissism. Sorry if you mentioned it and I didn't pay attention. But is it like the classical Golets-de scale applied to religion? Or because to me, it's very much related to SDO in a way.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I think conceptually it is, but I do think there's some distinction from it. I think the items we used were, I just have to double check, sorry. I don't remember what the items we used, sorry. So sorry, just looking at the items. I should have mentioned them, I just, oh yeah, so there were things like, I insist upon my religious group denomination getting the respect that is due to it. If my religious group or denomination had a major say in the world would be a much better place, and other items like that. The true worth of my religion.
It's more about recognition than about dominance, let's say. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's definitely about that idea of recognition.
Is recognition. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, is there anyone who'd like to comment on the work or ask any question?
Especially early career researchers, don't be shy, because you always are. That's not a good thing.
Well, in that case, I think we are happy to wrap it up for today. Thanks again, Christopher. It was interesting. It was very dense. It was thought-provoking. So all of us, we've got a food for thought and other things to discuss with you, or to read your paper, definitely. And I don't know, well, let's hope in some other future collaborations between us and you. And again, thanks very much. I don't know, Barbara, if you want to.
Yeah, I want to congratulate you, Chris, on your work. Truly, it was incredibly impressive. And all the time I was thinking about how that might relate to the Roma, to the Irish travelers, you know, and stuff we are interested in. So anytime you have an idea that we could test in a different context, we are really open to it, but we don't have longitudinal data, beware of that. But yeah, so really, I mean, there is a like very good common ground we have, and even if you are not here in person, never mind, but wow, any collaborations we might engage in together would be absolutely great. And we will be glad having you anytime for any period of time you want, during a scholarship or a postdoc or whatever. So you are the most welcome anytime you want to come.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for everyone. And yeah, I apologize for the density of the talk, but yeah. Thank you. I hope you found it interesting at least.
Absolutely,
So,
because it makes totally sense together. So it's important that you presented all those studies, not just the one you presented in Athens. So we are very, very happy for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Barbara.
And
Okay.
and enjoy your evening and good night, and say hello to your family and to your dogs, and hopefully we will see each other at some conferences soon, but not in Montreal because we are not going.